Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, and the release date for this podcast, the 28th episode of the PrimateCast, is Monday, September 22nd, 2014, and we are going to present to you the fourth installment of our five-part series from our coverage of the Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam, between August 11th and 16th of this year. Now, before getting into the interviews that we'll present in this podcast, there are five of them, I just want, as a primatologist myself, to talk a little bit about a recent field trip that I did. So I and a graduate student shipped off to study, to census and sample from the primate community inhabiting the banks of the Kinabatangan River, locally known as the Sungai Kinabatangan, which is in the Malaysian Borneo state of Sabah. And for anyone who knows the area will know that it's a fantastic place, rife with biodiversity, and including primate biodiversity with up to, let's say, 10 to 12 species inhabiting the area. And so it's really a fantastic place to do some good primate watching. Now, for me, it's one of those places that always reinvigorates my passion for doing just that and reminds me of why I got into this field in the beginning. But at the same time, it's also a place where conservation issues are extremely important. You have, of course, in Borneo, everybody knows the issues in Malaysia and also Indonesia, the issues surrounding the oil palm plantations, their growth, and complete devastation or annihilation even of the forests around there. And so along the banks of the Kinabatangan River, this is no exception. You have what is probably good functional in most cases riparian forest corridors. So as you're cruising up and down the river, you do see forest on all sides. But unfortunately, if you look a little bit beyond into the interior, often on the ridges or sometimes even little fronds of these oil palms poking into lap at the very waves of the river itself. But so this is very clear in your mind. And so for anybody who hasn't yet done so, the last podcast, which happened to come out while I was conducting this work, is about conservation. So many of these issues, not so much in Asia, but particularly in Africa, but many of the concepts still apply. So do check that out, podcast number 27, which was the third installment from our IPS coverage. Now, of course, when people think of Borneo, you probably think of the iconic species, the Bornean orangutan, which is present in high numbers along the banks of the Kinabatangan. And by the way, our second interview in this very podcast with Dr. Cheryl Knott will be about the Bornean orangutan, albeit from the Indonesian part of Borneo. But there's also that delightful resident, the proboscis monkey. And perhaps a little known fact about the proboscis monkey, last year, there was an online poll conducted by the Ugly Animal Preservation Society. It's a group that kind of takes a comedic, I suppose, approach to conservation of endangered species. But they had this poll to elect a mascot for their cause, which is to raise awareness for some of the less charismatic, or at least physically attractive animals out there, who are no less deserving of our concern. Now, the animal that topped that list happens to be the blobfish. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with the blobfish, please press pause now and Google it immediately. You will not be disappointed. But also featuring quite highly on that list of ugly animals was our very own proboscis monkey, to the chagrin of all primatologists, I'm sure. Now, while we may not agree with the result of that poll, we will certainly agree with the fact that proboscis monkeys, an endangered species, are in need of our conservation, and generating awareness about their cause and other animals' causes as well can't do any harm. And so the president of the society, Simon Watt, had this to say in an article that came out in The Guardian last year. I'll quote, "We've needed an ugly face for endangered animals for a long time. For too long, the cute and fluffy animals have taken the limelight, but now the blobfish will be a voice for the mingers who always get forgotten." No doubt a gem of wisdom there, and with that, I'd like to move into our interviews in this segment. And so we're going to be joined by five well-known researchers who will share their respective and collective works and ideas in the field of primatology. And so these interviews are going to include Dr. Agustin Fuentes, Dr. Cheryl Knott, Dr. Elisabetta Wieselbergi, Dr. James Hyam, and finally Dr. Joanna Setchell. So in our first interview, we're joined by Dr. Agustin Fuentes, who's professor and chair in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. Now, Dr. Fuentes is a very well-published and, as a result, well-known anthropologist and primatologist more specifically. He's done a lot to advance the field of primatology, as we'll hear about later. but he's also a great science communicator. And this is evidenced by his interview, which we'll get to in a second, but also by the numerous books he's authored, edited, co-edited, both textbooks for anthropology, human evolution, primatology, but also some popular books, including his work as a mythbuster currently, tackling our notions of human nature and how they can be used to explain, sometimes inappropriately, human behavior that we observe. Now, I first met Dr. Fuentes about 15 years ago when I joined his field school. When he was with Central Washington University, they put on a field school called the Balinese Macaque Project, which was in collaboration with the University of Guam and I believe a local university in Bali, Indonesia, Denpasar. I believe it was Udayana University. And so this field school was designed to introduce students to the study, observation of temple macaques, so long-tail macaques that have these long-lasting associations with temple complexes, and their interaction with humans, particularly with tourists, because the site at which we were researching was the Padang Tegal monkey forest, and there was a very, very strong ecotourism project going on there where so many people were coming from around the world to see the monkeys and interact with them in various ways, sometimes, usually in negative ways, of course, as we don't typically encourage interaction between humans, particularly tourists, and local primates. But anyway, so that field school was about behavior and observation and ecology and the human-macaque interface, for which Dr. Fuentes has become quite well renowned. And in this interview, he's going to be talking about a field which he was instrumental in developing called ethnoprimatology. And so at the beginning of the interview, he's going to start by explaining this idea and how it came about, and of course, its relevance to the field of primatology.
The whole point of introducing, let's say, a novel approach in primate studies is to reflect what's going on in the world. There are a number of people who've been doing ethnoprimatology who may not even realize it. That is, mixing together methods from primatological, ecological, social anthropological, ethnographic methodologies and approaches, and trying to ask really integrated questions about primates, including humans. One of the biggest problems that has plagued primatology since it began as a field of study has been the idea that humans are separate from other primates, that there's a human world and there's a natural world. And in fact, it was long held that the best data on non-human primates comes from areas where they're as far away from humans as possible. Now, there's a number of problems with that. I'll just lay out a few and suggest why ethnoprimatology might be some good ways to sort of ameliorate those problems. One of the main problems is that most primates live in primate communities. It's not that common for single species of primates to occur. And in fact, throughout history, in an evolutionary sense, there's usually multiple species of primates in communities, and there are often humans making up one of those species. And so humans and other primates have coexisted for long periods of time in many, many different contexts in the range of the non-human primates. So humans and other primates form communities, and in that context, if you're doing good ecology or good behavioral ecological study, you have to include all of the salient aspects of those ecologies, and it is obvious, or at least should be obvious to everyone, that humans are a very salient component of the ecology. Another thing that an ethnoprimatological approach helps us understand is the increasing massive habitat manipulation by humans. Humans do really well by modifying the world to better suit their needs. And as they do that, they create cascade effects in local ecologies affecting all of the other participants, all the other fauna and flora in those ecologies. And when this happens with other primates, there's some particularly interesting impacts. And so understanding human cultural patterns, human ecological patterns, and why humans do what they do can tell us a lot about the ecosystems of other primates. And it is very likely, and there's some pretty good evidence to support this, that many other primates have, over evolutionary time, adapted to the particular patterns of the humans that are their co-ecological partners. So humans are part of the ecology, so if we're interested in other primates, we've got to understand the human impacts in that sense. But the third thing is that there are many areas where humans and other primates actually interact behaviorally, physiologically, and they share ecologies, even co-construct ecologies. They're particularly pathogen ecologies. So the relationship between humans and other primates is not just about predation or competition. There's a whole wide array of these kinds of relationships. And ethnoprimatological approaches that ask us about human culture, human ecology, and human behavior, while asking about primate behavior, primate ecology, and the interfaces between the humans and other primates, that kind of approach is going to give us a broader, richer data set and allow us to ask better questions and maybe even get better answers.
So it's certainly a truism that these so-called pristine areas that haven't really seen too much modification by human hands are getting fewer and farther between. And as Dr. Fuentes mentioned, many cases may never have existed at all in the first place. And so ethnoprimatology does seem like an appropriate approach or framework through which to think about doing research on primates. But we wanted to get kind of an idea, maybe more practically, about what that would look like on the ground. I mean, how we do ethnoprimatology in practice.
So methodologically, there's a sort of large jumbled bag of skill sets that are used. A number of us who are active in this area are developing sort of different kinds of methodologies and trying to get those into print so that people can use them. Right now, the most ethnoprimatological studies or the best at least, are done with teams. That is, primatologists, ethnographers, ecologists, geographers, economists, working together to sort of develop multidisciplinary interfaces and trying to describe that. So it's really bringing together multiple toolkits. But at a very base level, the main toolkits are behavioral ecology, ethnography, and some sort of more complex ecological approaches. This becomes incredibly important when we think about conservation as well.
So for anybody who's interested in following this up, this idea of conservation and management and the role of ethnoprimatology in these areas, do check out a couple of books that Dr. Fuentes has co-edited. The first from 2002, which is called Primates Face to Face, The Conservation Implications of Human and Non-Human Primate Interconnections, co-edited with Linda Wolf. And then also in 2011 here, a book called Monkeys on the Edge, Ecology and Management of Long-tailed Macaques and Their Interface with Humans. But in the final segment of this interview, I kind of wanted to switch gears here because I was informed a little while ago that Dr. Fuentes is involved heavily in a new project. And this new project is the development of the International Encyclopedia of Primatology, which is going to be, exactly as it sounds, an encyclopedia of concepts within the field of primatology, specific to primatologists, students of primatology, and practitioners as well. And so I myself was asked to create an entry for this, which I admitted to Dr. Fuentes is a very daunting thing. I was both extremely honored and mortified at the idea of having to write an entry for an encyclopedia, which is not Wikipedia. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about how this came about. And so to end this interview, we're going to hear about the International Encyclopedia of Primatology.
One of the things that I'm doing recently is I am the senior editor on the International Encyclopedia of Primatology that we're putting together now. It's a multi-year project. There are 14 associate editors and nearly 300 contributors to over 600 entries. Why would anyone want to do this? Well, there's actually a good reason, because in a world of rapidly expanding knowledge, data, and interpretations relative to this incredibly broad thing we call primatology, having an ease of access in electronic format to not just summaries of the main arguments, ideas, terms, histories, and people in primatology, but also having quick reference lists and having that digitally cross-linked and easily accessible is going to give a whole new toolkit to students and practitioners alike. So, in a few years when this thing pans out, if it works as we hope it does, there should be an incredible new encyclopedic context for rapid primatological knowledge generation.
So that was Dr. Agustin Fuentes telling us about ethnoprimatology and the somewhat unrelated work, the International Encyclopedia of Primatology, although expect to see featured quite prominently an entry devoted, or multiple entries devoted to the field of ethnoprimatology in that volume of work. Now, in our next interview from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society that was held in Hanoi, Vietnam, we're going to be joined by Dr. Cheryl Knott. Now, as I mentioned a bit earlier, she will be talking about her work with the Bornean orangutans, but Dr. Knott is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Boston University, as well as the director of the Gunung Palung Orangutan Project, which is dedicated both to the study and conservation of orangutans in Borneo, and as I mentioned, in Indonesian Borneo. So Dr. Knott is going to be telling us about her long-term work, which she established a couple of decades ago now, I guess it was, with these Bornean orangutans, and her focus specifically on energy, balance, physiology, and behavior of orangutans. And one of the things that Dr. Knott is really known for was her early establishment of methodologies to assess the physiological status of animals, primates in the wild, which up until the mid-90s really had not been done. And so that has really had a long-lasting impact in the field of primatology. So here's Dr. Knott talking about her work in this context.
So I've been studying wild orangutans since 1992 in Gunung Palung National Park, and I first went out there when I was a graduate student at Harvard University for my PhD. And essentially my main kind of overriding project aim is to understand how changes in the forest, so changes in ecology, how that affects orangutan behavior and physiology and evolution. And so my initial project was looking at orangutan interbirth intervals and reproduction. So they have the longest birth interval of any mammal. So they only give birth once every 6 to 8 years. And so what I did at that time was I developed a method to collect urine to analyze hormones in the wild, because at that time no one actually was really doing that in wild primates. So I developed this method of drawing urine on filter paper because one of the limitations was we didn't have a freezer. Now we actually, it's easier to get a freezer out there, but anyway, we developed this method of drawing urine on filter paper and then bringing it back to the lab where we can analyze the hormones in urine. And what I discovered was that in Borneo especially, but also other Southeast Asian rainforests, they have very dramatic fluctuations in fruit availability. Called mass fruiting, which happens about every 4 years or so, and that's these big fluctuations in fruit are really important for orangutan behavior and reproduction. So when the fruit is higher, their hormones increase, and they're more likely to get pregnant during those periods. And that this is a similar mechanism as what happens in humans, is in women, is that hormones are tracking what's called energy balance. And so if you're losing weight, your hormones go down, you're less likely to get pregnant, and if your hormones increase, you're more likely to get pregnant.
So as Dr. Knott is about to explain, her work has really focused on energy balance and its relationship to orangutan behavioral ecology, reproduction, physiology, and so on. And so we asked Dr. Knott to elaborate a little bit on these methodologies and some of the insights that have been gained through their employment.
Yeah, so energy expenditures and energy intake is in a big part of my work, is developing methods for that. So initially the methods, I use several different methods. So one of the methods is what's called the computational method. So in terms of energy expenditure, we measure, we basically record everything, all their activity and how much time they spent in each activity, and then there are kind of standard values you can assign so that if you're traveling, if you're sitting, if you're hanging, so we look at the activity and the body position, and then we assign a energetic number to that. And then, so let's say you spend, 200 minutes in a certain position, then that has a certain energetic value. So you can calculate, you can kind of compute mathematically the estimate of energy expenditure. But of course that's, an estimate. So then we have been developing other methods to use more sort of physiology to do it. And one of the first methods I used was ketones. And so ketones are produced in urine when you are metabolizing your own fat deposits. So we actually, one of my first papers in 1998 was on that and showing how during this mass fruitings they were losing weight and there were extended periods of low food intake, and they were burning their own fat deposits. So ketones are, we use these dipsticks that are for humans. They put in the urine. They don't always work for all primates though, and you have to be really bad, like really losing weight. So then a few years ago, with my colleague, my former student Melissa Emery Thompson, we helped work on developing methods for C-peptide. And C-peptide is a molecule which is it's sort of a byproduct of pro-insulin, so it's related to insulin or correlated with insulin. And so that is actually a measure of kind of energy usage. And it's a better measure in a lot of ways because you can measure like good condition as well as bad condition, whereas ketones is only if things are bad. And so that is becoming one of the kind of new methods, which is great because you can just get the urine. You don't have to have the detailed behavioral data. Of course, it's nice to have that to also reinforce the hormonal data as well. But that's one of the kind of new advances is the use of C-peptide. And then the other method as well is cortisol, which is a more standard hormone. But cortisol, especially in orangutans, is a good measure of energy because cortisol is excreted it increases when you're under kind of metabolic stress. Now, it could be because you don't have enough to eat. It also could be that you're stressed out because you have too many, fights going on or something. But cortisol is another method as well. So in terms of measuring calories, because we also want to do intake, what we do is we collect very detailed data for every feeding bout. So everything they eat, the number of fruits per minute, the size of the fruit, the percentage eaten, and then we collect the fruits and we bring them back to our lab at the camp, and we divide it up into the different parts, like the flesh of the fruit, let's say the skin, the seed, and then we weigh and dry that, and then we can analyze back in our lab at Boston University or at Harvard. We measure the nutrients in the food, and so we can actually, for every day, we can say how many calories they consumed, and how much protein, how much fiber, how much carbohydrate, how much lipid, and so then we can get a pretty good estimate of calorie intake, and compare that with the calorie expenditure. So yeah, that's another big part of my work. We do a lot of stuff with plants, really, collecting all the plants and doing the processing.
So what Dr. Knott is describing here has become a very successful example, perhaps a model, we might say, of what benefits can come out of integrating field observation and sample collection with a very strong bench work component, and particularly in the areas of reproductive and nutritional physiology, but also, as Dr. Knott mentioned towards the end there, laboratory analysis of the nutritional environment in which the orangutans find themselves. And so just in the next segment of this interview, Dr. Knott's going to elaborate a little bit about some of the major findings of her work, extending from this series of methodologies.
Some of my major findings, well, one of them was just my first finding was that the orangutans are paying this sort of big physiological cost for low food, that they were losing weight, that the females also were tracking energy balance, just like humans. So we have the females, also have their ovarian hormones are very sort of closely correlated with changes in food. And when I first started my PhD, people thought maybe that what was happening in humans was unique, that maybe other apes weren't like that. And so it tells us that this is a very old kind of adaptation in humans and more general than we had thought before. And then I've also been doing a lot of work with males, so looking at male flange development and this sort of phenomenon of having two kinds of males, flanged and unflanged. They're sexually mature. So we collect testosterone and sort of looking at what's going on there. We discovered that a lot of the males at our site, they go through this, they can only maintain the flange state for a fairly brief time, and after that they become what we call past prime, where their flanges kind of shrivel up. So I've been looking at a lot of questions about what the evolution of flanging, the evolution of this phenomenon, and what, theoretically why that exists. And then we also actually do work in zoos too. We collaborate with zoos, and one of the things we found from the zoo data was that males that have current males have high testosterone, they actually develop flanges earlier than other males. And so some of it may also be kind of like a state trait, something that's about their early condition, also may influence how quickly they develop flanges and their adult testosterone levels. So I think that's also part of the picture. So, the male story is still ongoing, to really figuring out, bimatchism in orangutans, but we're trying to get at that through both, captive and field data, measuring hormones. It's hard to really follow these same individuals over a long time. And the males also are the ones that leave. And so these younger males, they will leave our study site and go someplace else. So it makes it kind of challenging then to study that. But, that's one of the things that we've been doing as well. So essentially, we collect data on everything, also looking at juvenile development, looking at, because we have a very comprehensive data set, collecting, all this behavioral data, the nutrition, the energy expenditure, the hormones, that, almost any question we can actually answer. The data set is just having the time to do it, to delve further into everything.
So no doubt daunting and perhaps a little overwhelming to have access to so much data. But of course, this is a problem that all of us would readily accept, especially, relative to the alternative of having too little, because these long-term field sites and long-term data sets really allow us to start asking the more pertinent and most interesting questions, I think. And this is something that Dr. Knott is going to draw upon in the final segment of this interview when she starts to discuss her goals for the future of this project.
Well, I think for the future, we have these long life histories of individuals, and so we'll be able to answer a lot of questions about orangutan adaptation and evolution by looking at these individuals over time. One of the other things we're working on right now is this comparison between study sites and looking at female hormones and trying to understand why there's longer interbirth intervals in Sumatra compared to Borneo. And so we're doing this kind of, inter-site comparison. So some of the future things I think will involve more kind of inter-site comparisons. So trying to understand why different sites are different. So I think that's kind of an exciting area, and also a way to collaborate with other colleagues, other places, and looking at really, as we also develop more detailed methods, I think we can analyze things more in much more detail than we have in the past. I also would love to find some way that we can really track males and females over a much bigger area, because we really even don't know how big of an area they use. And some people are starting now to do, or have done, like overnight follows, and I have a student who's going to start doing that soon as well, and trying to track them, when they leave our study area. So, basically all orangutans, use study areas that are bigger than use areas that are bigger than anybody's study area, and so we really still don't even have an answer to that question. So that's another big question to address.
So that was Dr. Cheryl Knott telling us about her work with Bornean orangutans. Now, just a reminder, you are listening to the PrimateCast in our coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held between August 11th and 16th of this year in Hanoi, Vietnam. In our next interview, the third of this installment, we're joined by Dr. Elisabetta Wieselberghi. She's research director in the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technology with the National Research Council of Italy, where she's based in Rome. Now, she's going to start this interview by first telling us about the foundations of her research.
Yes, I do several things at the same time. I work with the captive capuchin monkeys in my lab in Rome, but I also started something like 10 years ago field research on capuchin monkeys in Brazil. This group of capuchin monkeys lives in a rather dry habitats between Cerrado and Caratinga, and they have a very special behavior because they habitually use stone tools to crack open nuts. And these palm nuts are sometimes very, very hard, like 20 times harder than walnuts. And these monkeys, we were able to weigh them in the field, and adult females are about 2 kilos. Males are 3.5 kilos, sometimes the dominant male is over 4 kilos, but still they are very tiny individuals compared to us or chimpanzees.
So Dr. Wieselbergy's research has really focused on this behavior, the cognitive capacities of capuchins, and the emergence of this nut-cracking behavior. And for anybody who has not yet seen it, you can probably quite easily find it on YouTube, capuchin nut-cracking. It really is impressive to see these, as Dr. Wieselbergy mentioned, these small animals, relatively small animals, at least compared to us or chimpanzees, who are regularly known to use tools to do things like this, banging their rocks on these nuts and actually successfully extracting the good stuff within. But as she's going to explain in the next segment of this interview, her research has proceeded far from myopically, and so she's getting into various ways to approach the study of this behavior, in addition to looking at other things of the behavioral ecology of the animals in the wild.
We studied these groups of capuchin monkeys in many different ways. We do systematic field observations of ecological conditions and behavior, some hormonal studies, and we also do some experiments in the field. The experiments are mainly meant to better explore the cognitive capacities of these animals. And I must say that we are a team of people, because since the very beginning we collaborate with some Brazilian researchers, especially Professor Izar, and the project has started also with the researcher from the United States, especially Professor Dori Forghesi from the University of Georgia. And we have been coordinated our work in such a way that data collected by one of us is useful to also interpret the data collected by others. And we have been really successful in this exchange of information, and so we know the ecology of these animals, the behavior, and how they master this incredible skill.
So in the next segment of this interview, Dr. Wieselbergy explains how this diverse approach to her research has really allowed her to understand more holistically the cognitive capacities of these animals and how that helps determine their behavior in the wild, particularly relating to this use of stone tools.
What we found during these years, as I was telling, by looking at different aspects of the capuchin's behavior, is that, for example, their use of tools is not necessary for survival. You can survive very well in Fazenda Boa Vista even without using tools. So this is very difficult from the normal common view that tools are used because you need to access foods that are otherwise not accessible, and this is done because you are hungry and you are, So this, in fact, after we, Spagnoletti published a paper on this topic, many other people looked at the same topic in chimpanzees and in orangs, and they also found that, in fact, tool use is not necessary for survival. We also looked at the complexity and the cognitive demands of the task and how the skill is acquired. And as far as I can tell, at the moment, there is no evidence that chimpanzees, that are the closest relatives to the human beings, do any better than capuchins. Of course, we have to do more research and really looked even in more depth at this issue. But at the moment, we really demonstrated these tiny monkeys that split from the common lineage something like 35-40 million years ago, are as good as wild chimpanzees.
In addition to her research, Dr. Wieselbergy and her team have also taken steps toward conservation of capuchins in Brazil, as she explains here in the next segment of this interview.
And I must also say that we recently, really last week it was ready, we made a scientific documentary, mainly by ourselves, entitled The Birded Capuchin Monkeys of Fazenda Boa Vista, in which we describe all aspects of their behavior, And we also have some extra chapters that show how the work began many years ago, what kind of experiments we did, and the local community. What do they think about monkeys, and what can be done to preserve this population of wild-bearded capuchins that is now surrounded by soja fields. So we are really preoccupied for these monkeys and for our research as well.
So once again, another primate population in peril, living in an isolated forest fragment, obviously surrounded on all sides by various human activities, with seemingly no place to go. So to end the interview, we just asked Dr. Wieselbergi to leave us with a final message.
Oh, if I have a message is please help us to preserve this population from extinction, because this is a unique population, and we invested so much in studying them that would be a pity for everybody if they disappear.
So that was Dr. Elisabetta Wieselbergi talking about her research and conservation efforts involving capuchins in Brazil, and leaving us with a message that I think will resonate with all primatologists and conservationists as something that we need to continue to strive to do. So once again, you're listening to the PrimateCast's coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th of this year. We're now going to be joined by Dr. James Hyam, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at New York University and a leading researcher in primate sexual selection and communication, with a specific focus on visual signaling in reproduction. We started the interview by asking him to tell us about his general research program.
So the main objectives is really just to look at how sexual selection as a process has shaped reproductive strategies at the genetical, morphological, physiological and behavioral levels. And we're interested in everything from different sorts of competition, how that's mediated physiologically and morphologically, and mate choice, signals and communication, mate attractiveness, and leading up ultimately to the effects of all of those selection pressures, not only in forming species and adaptation, but at a speciational level and leading to population level processes and forming new species.
So here we asked Dr. Hyam to tell us a little bit about how he goes about conducting these studies.
We use a lot of different methods from multiple disciplines. I have an endocrinology laboratory, so we collect feces and urine, sometimes blood, increasingly saliva, from which from free-ranging animals usually, sometimes from captive individuals, but usually free-ranging animals, including a lot of wild populations. And we measure different steroid hormones, so glucocorticoids and androgens, estrogens, progesterogens, but also other aspects of the endocrine system, so urinary C-peptide of insulin, for example, as an energetic marker, and also increasingly immunological markers. We use genetics in a number of different ways. We use, obviously, phylogenies in our phylogenetic analyses, and they're derived from molecular data on species relationships. We use genetics for paternity analyses in our studies. We also use genetics, we have some recent studies using genetics to look at heritability and fitness of traits over time, so the relationship between trait variation and reproductive output over time. One of our study sites has a genetic parentage database and reproductive output database that goes back for decades. We use techniques from ethology, such as behavioral observations. We use techniques from experimental psychology, such as presentations of images and stimuli, visual stimuli towards individual animals. In our analysis of signals and communication, we use a lot of techniques, a lot of computational techniques from computer vision, techniques from machine learning techniques, computational photography techniques, in order to analyze signals from digital images and analyze variation in those signals. increasingly I'm looking at hard tissue morphology. So I have a new PhD student with a colleague of mine who's looking at hard tissue signatures of different types of sexual selection. So looking at things like not just bones, but also muscle attachment areas on bones to look at, kind of muscle potential intra and inter-individual variation in muscle size and things like this. And so lots of different approaches to try and tackle the questions. I would say that our research isn't tied together by a species, or it isn't tied together by a method, it's tied together by a process. Sexual selection and its effects on reproduction and reproduction, that includes a lot of communication.
So I think we can all get quite a clear sense of what Dr. Hyam's group has been able to build over the years through the diversity of their approaches, converging on the central theme of sexual selection and communication. But we asked Dr. Hyam to maybe talk a little bit about the big picture aims of this work, and even to run through a couple of current projects that he's got going.
What we're trying to do is put together a big comparative picture of the effects of sexual selection and how it produces and how these different mechanisms of sexual selection end up creating their own selection pressures that spiral to the point where you create a huge amount of diversity. And as a consequence of those selection pressures, we see the extraordinary diversity that you see among the primates. So we've published on relationships between signals and behaviour and hormones and species such as crested macaques, rhesus macaques, drills, baboons. Our current research, we just had some papers out about Gwenon facial evolution comparatively, and also we have a cool paper with the postdoc Constance de Buch as first author, showing heritability and relationships to fitness of rhesus macaque coloration, so that it's heritable over time and increases your fitness in terms of your reproductive output, your attractiveness to opposite sex.
Now, although he mentioned it only briefly just a moment ago, for those of you who have not yet seen it, do check out the paper called Character Displacement of Cercopithecine Primate Visual Signals, which was published by Dr. Hyam's group in the journal Nature Communications this June. Now, this work addresses the great diversity that we see in the African forest guenons' physical appearance, and specifically tackling the issue of visual signals and what role they might play in species recognition, which has important consequences for speciation in this group of primates. And so he was here at IPS this week talking about that study. But more generally, Dr. Hyam's body of work and the diversity of approaches that have gone into it have really improved our understanding of the role of communication, specifically visual signaling in primate reproduction. So he's going to leave us here on the podcast with his take on the current state of primatology and promising avenues for future research.
I think there's reasons that this is a very exciting time to be a primatologist. One is the genomic coverage that we're getting is way better than you're getting in other taxa. We have many species where we have whole genomes, and that's really becoming a cheap thing that a lot of people are able to do. Secondly, I think that sensory ecology is really taking off, because we know so much about primate vision, say, and the primate auditory system compared to what people know about a lot of other taxa. So when we're able to think about signals that primates are giving off, we can really model them in terms of primate perception in a way that it's quite hard to do for a lot of taxa, because we don't really understand their, say, visual systems anywhere near as well as we understand the primate visual system, for example. I also think that the physiology, we can do a lot more than a lot of taxa can do without having to trap our animals, because a lot of taxa just give tiny little excreta and stuff that you will never find and things, whereas we have these larger animals where we can regularly collect excreta and we can measure a lot of things in them. So I think that primatology has been troubled by the need for long-term monitoring and the small sample sizes and the absence of available methodologies. The methodologies are becoming available that will really help. Those long-running field sites that people have been running for 40 years plus in some cases have now created this backstory, this of data through which everything can be looked at and interpreted, and a lot of these things are really giving an insight into these longer-lived animals. And Also, I think that, I guess I just think that a number of things are coming together that collectively mean that it's an optimistic time to be a primatologist compared to, say, 20 years ago. That said, of course, all the primate populations are in much, much worse state than they are 20 years ago. And, there's a real risk that the opportunity to study a lot of species will be lost.
So that was Dr. James Hyam telling us about his work. Now, in the final interview from this, the fourth installment of our coverage from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th, we are going to be joined by Dr. Joanna Setchell. Dr. Setchell is a reader in the Department of Anthropology at Durham University and a member of the Behavioral Ecology and Evolution Research Center. She is also, in addition to her academic affiliations, editor-in-chief of the journal, the International Journal of Primatology, as well as vice president for research in the International Primatological Society. So to begin this interview, Dr. Setchell is going to talk quite broadly about her research, particularly as it has focused on a colony of mandrills in Gabon, which she has been working with for almost 2 decades now.
So I've been studying mandrills in a semi-free ranging colony in Gabon since 1996, so that's 18 years now. And the advantage of the colony that we study is that you can see the animals every day, and we know individual animals. So mandrills in the wild we know they live in very large groups, and they're almost impossible to follow in the forest, and no one has ever managed to habituate them so that you can follow them every day. So the advantage of the colony that I study is that we can do that, and so we can build up life history information over time for the individuals we study. So we can look at basic things like when females have babies, and then we can use genetic analyses to find out who the father is, and we can compare that with dominance rank in the females and in the males. So we can look at reproductive scheduling and find out that females start to have babies at about 4, and then once they've started to have babies, they continue to have one every year for the rest of their reproductive lives, and they finish at around in their mid-20s. Whereas males are reproductively capable, so they can have a baby at 4, they could sire a baby at 4, but they won't actually be large enough and physically dominant enough until they're about 10. And when they're 10, if they're lucky and they become dominant, then they might sire a lot of offspring, but they won't last very long in that position, and all the males are dead by 20. And whereas females seem to die of natural causes, males die because another male kills them, so they get into a fight and die of their wounds. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at, and that illustrates the advantage of having the long-term data on a colony and being able to see the same animals day in, day out, and watch the soap opera of what they get up to every day.
So within that context, Dr. Setchell's main body of work has looked at sexual selection in primates, in these mandrills, and specifically the role of signals in sexual selection in primates. And so many of you may know the various works that she has published regarding the visual signals that male mandrills in particular are producing. So obviously everybody knows the mandrills have these extremely and fantastically bright red and sometimes blue faces. And so Dr. Setchell's work has been investigating what contributes to the development of those features, those signals, and in turn, how they impact the reproductive success of males within the colony. But in this interview, after just touching on that work very, very briefly at the beginning of the next segment, Dr. Setchell instead is going to be talking about a less well-known fact about signaling in mandrills and potentially other primates as well. And that relates to the importance of olfactory cues.
For my PhD and then for my first couple of postdocs, I was interested in colour mainly, and that's because mandrills are beautifully colourful. But the other thing the mandrills do, which is extremely unusual in an old world monkey, is that they have a sternal gland, so a gland on their chest, and males rub it against trees, and they put a lot of energy into doing that. And you can see, for a start, that they work hard to do that, and you can also sometimes see that they get infections. They rub their chest so hard against a tree that they get bits of tree in their chest and get infected, so they're clearly investing a lot in marking. So I became very interested in what it is that mark tells another mandrill. So if a mandrill's wandering through the forest and smells an odour mark, what is it that conveys? So we did some analyses. One of the great things about the surf mandrills is that we can catch them every year, so we can get samples of that odour. And we did some analyses in Italy, in Florence, looking at the chemicals that are in that odour. And we discovered that, like all other mammalian scent signals, they're very complicated, but you can pick up signals of sex, so you can tell the difference between male and female. You can pick up signals of age, so you can distinguish between an adolescent and an adult male. And particularly, you can find dominant rank. So an alpha male has a much more complex signal than an adolescent male. So all that's really important information if you're a mandrill. If you're walking through the forest and you smell another mandrill, you can determine whether it's male or female, whether it's high-ranking, and so on. So if you're a male mandrill, it's important to stay away from other males. If you're a female mandrill, you might want to approach a male if you want to mate, but you might want to stay away if you don't want to mate. So we did that, but the more interesting thing that we did was to compare genetics with the odour, because we were interested in finding out how mandrills choose a mate. And one thing we know about how they choose a mate is that they choose mates that are genetically dissimilar to themselves. So all the work that I'd done on colour signals is actually of no use there, because colour signals don't tell you anything about genetic difference or similarity. But the advantage of odour is that if you compare your own odour with the odour of another animal, then you can, or you should be able to determine how different those are. And if the odour signals genetics, then you can pick up genetic differences. And in fact, that does seem to be what mandrills do.
So it might seem a little bit ironic here. On the one hand, you have this amazingly visual creature where it seems incredibly obvious that those features of the male mandrill's face must have a big impact on the mate choice exhibited by females. But if you look at the body of Dr. Sechel's work, or the collection of works, it becomes evident that perhaps this more recent work with olfaction may actually be better predictive of mate choice in female mandrills related to the different smells produced by the males. And so that's quite a fascinating avenue for research. And so within primates more generally, there hasn't really been a lot done with olfaction and the importance of olfactory cues in signaling. And this is obviously because we as primates ourselves, we humans, our perceptual world seems to be dominated by what we see. And so we expect that extends to primates. And in general, there is probably a reduced reliance on olfaction, but that doesn't mean, as Dr. Sechel explains in this next segment, that it is unimportant.
I think it hasn't been looked at partly because we are visual animals ourselves. So the first thing we do is see an animal and we concentrate on what it looks like. Also because although we use olfaction as a species, we don't pay a lot of attention to it. So it tends to be unconscious. So often we'll avoid something because it gives out an olfactory signal, but we're not really aware that that's what's going on. So we're not aware of olfaction in the same way we are aware of visual signals. And there is this, there are data to show that olfaction is reduced in old world monkeys and apes, but the fact it's reduced doesn't mean it's reduced to zero. So quite a lot of these studies are sold as though it's reduced to zero, but it's just reduced in relation to the highly olfactive species like mice, rodents, and so on. So I think it's been understudied because we're not aware of it in our own species, and because it's less important, but that doesn't mean it's not important.
And just to drive home that point a little bit, we got Dr. Sechel to go on and talk a little bit about the human literature in how we might perceive odors of other individuals and how that might affect our perceptions of attractiveness of those other individuals.
Yes, so the interesting thing about the human work is that it's actually done, it tends to be done by putting T-shirts on people, and then taking the T-shirts off the people, putting them in a glass jar, and then asking other people to smell those T-shirts and say what they think of the smell. Those experiments have detected, in some cases at least, the same sort of pattern, and that is that humans don't like the smell of T-shirts anyway, but they dislike less the smell of T-shirts of genetically different people. So that's analogous perhaps to what the mandrills are doing. But the interesting thing there is that we're actually just asking humans to rate the smell of a T-shirt, which is very different to the smell of an animal. And also this idea that no humans like the smell of a T-shirt. So all the T-shirts are disliked, but you just find differences in how much they're disliked. So the next question, I suppose, would be to find out how much mandrills like smell. But that's quite a difficult thing to do.
So I'm not sure if Dr. Setchell has any plans to run these T-shirt tests with the mandrills themselves, but in the last segment of this interview, she's just going to touch upon some of the future projects and directions of her research.
A couple of future research directions. One is, having looked largely at male smell, I'm very interested in female smell as well. So for that, because the mandrills are quite difficult to study, we've moved to studying baboons in captivity, because then you can actually get very close up to the animals, and the animals are prepared, if you're lucky, to present to you so that you can collect an odour sample without having to anaesthetise an animal, which is a great advantage. So that's one future direction, and that's a postdoc who's working on that. And then I'm also interested in moving into teeth. So we're making a study of mandrill teeth, and again this is related to the long-term nature of the study that we do, that eventually when the animals die we can collect their remains, collect their skulls and importantly their teeth, and this links into the fact that teeth are the most common fossils. So with extinct primates and extinct human ancestors, the only evidence we really have of teeth. And so if we can look at the teeth of extant animals that we know, of whom we've got life history data, we can start to link those two together, and then we can start to interpret these fossil teeth.
So that was Dr. Joanna Setchell of Durham University telling us about her work into the role of olfaction in primate sexual selection. We'd like to thank all of our guests that appeared on this installment of the Primate Cast and invite you, the listener, to join us next time, which will be the fifth and final installment of our coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in August this year in Hanoi, Vietnam. And we're going to include interviews with guests such as Cedric Sueur, Odile Petit, Nicolas Claydier, Jörg Masse, and finally, Joshua Plotnick. So, until next time.
You have been listening to the Primate Cast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicasp.pri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.